So as I've been rewatching all of the Borderlands 4 videos and information we've gotten so far to make all of these Borderlands 4 videos, one of the big things that I've been starting to have a theory of is that Borderlands 4 is going to have a much more substantial endgame than any previous game in the franchise. And there's also one piece of information that I've been thinking about quite a lot that also seems to point to that a little bit more, and that's the mention of dungeons, and more specifically vault dungeons. And one of the big reasons for this is we really haven't had other things, especially vaults, being called dungeons in any previous Borderlands game. They were always just called a vault, and pretty much every vault in every other Borderlands game has essentially just been a boss inside of it. It hasn't been like a big sprawling dungeon or anything like that with multiple bosses and a lot of enemies. It's always essentially just been a vault monster within the vault, and you either fight inside the vault or you fight something outside of the vault, and that's pretty much been it. But if you watch the big Borderlands 4 showcase, something they went over seems to point to vaults now being actual dungeons, because during this gameplay they went and captured what's called a silo, which was essentially they just hacked a computer and it popped out this balloon out of a silo that gave them a fast travel to a certain location, but it also showed them an area of where a vault key fragment would be. And they also mentioned with this that once you get enough of these vault key fragments that it unlocks the vault dungeon to go into. And them describing it as that is very interesting. And based upon how the game world of Borderlands 4 has been designed, I think there's at minimum going to be 4 different vaults. Because in Borderlands 4, it's going to be much more of a seamless world, not fully open world, but seamless. And they mentioned that this is split between 4 different zones with almost no loading screens. So my general idea for that is that Borderlands 4 is going to be split into 4 different zones. There will be a load screen going between those 4 different zones that are all going to be massive. But once you load into that zone, that whole zone is seamless. No matter if you're going to a different boss arena or going to do this mission, if you're in that zone and stay in that zone, it's all seamless. There are no loading screens. So to add on top of that, it seems that all 4 of these different areas will have their own vault, and you'll have to explore all of these different areas to find all of the vault key fragments to unlock the vault of that zone. And we're not sure if these vaults would be tied to the main campaign. I assume in some way they would be, or at least a couple of them would be. Now, I'm not saying there's only going to be 4 vaults. We know for a fact there is going to be multiple. The developers clarified this, but we don't know the exact amount. I would be very surprised if there wasn't at least 4, and maybe some other one, maybe at like the end of the game, you get to a final vault for the campaign, or maybe there's an additional vault or additional couple vaults specifically for the end game. But right now, I'm assuming at least 4 of these vault dungeons. Now, since they're calling these dungeons, I have a handful of different ideas of what these could be. The first one, and something a lot of other people have also suggested, is these are actually going to be like the takedowns of Borderlands 4. If you never played Borderlands 3, takedowns were essentially Borderlands versions of raids. They were free updates, and they were actually really good. They had super high mob density. They were actually pretty long. All of them had a handful of different bosses that you had to defeat to go through them. They were generally really good. The second one wasn't as good, specifically because of how they designed some of the objectives and some of the bosses, but the first takedown of Borderlands 3 was incredible. Some of the best Borderlands content ever made. And if they were just taking these vaults, adding in this key to give you progression to actually unlock them, and then they were essentially takedowns in a vault, that could actually just be incredibly good for the longevity of Borderlands 4, especially if they're really difficult and have multiple bosses and really high density throughout them. Ending with you actually taking on the vault monster at the end could be incredibly cool. They could also just be their take on dungeons from, say, other MMOs or other RPGs or other ARPGs, where it's just a more expansive area you go explore that's generally more difficult and ends with a boss at the end and maybe has some objective throughout it. And this could bring into question if there's going to be any randomization with these. Now, Borderlands really hasn't had a ton of randomization throughout its different games, especially when you compare it to something like ARPGs do. Now, we did have some of this this in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, if they were going to have these vault dungeons have randomization within them, I would hope it would be much better utilized than something like we got in the endgame of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. But I would say it's a much higher possibility that these are not randomized than that they would be randomized. Now, we have gotten some pretty big information very recently as well, because some Borderlands 4 developers were at a PAX East panel, and within that panel we got it confirmed that dedicated drops will be in Borderlands 4. So they specifically said every boss and every mini boss will have dedicated drops, but they also said that vaults are replayable and refarmable without getting more vault keys. So it seems that as we progress throughout the game and as we get all of the vault key fragments and make the vault key, that we just unlock that content and we can play it and replay it as much as possible. And they did also essentially confirm that these vaults are going to have at least one boss within them, which is kind of what we would all expect. Though we would expect that there would at least be the vault monster as one boss within them. We don't know if there will be more bosses, but I think this is also a really positive thing. Once we unlock these vaults and go through that progression that first time, we can just replay these vaults as much as possible. Presumably they're going to be using Moxie's Encore machine like all the other bosses and missions in the game, where once we defeat it, we can just flip the switch and it resets and we can go back in. And the developers did also mention that these dungeons are going to be difficult, which really isn't something developers usually say when talking about much things in the Borderlands franchise. And I don't think they really talked about anything else in this way for the Borderlands 4 showcase. Maybe the bosses, but they were generally just talking about the bosses being much bigger and better than previous games, not really talking about the difficulty. So them specifying that these dungeons are going to be difficult, them calling them dungeons, meaning they're going to be more than just a one boss thing, makes me pretty excited because there is just a lot of possibilities. They could do something like Destiny 2 does, where every one of these vaults has some other unique mechanic in them, or they could design these dungeons kind of like MMOs or something like World of Warcraft would design their dungeons, where it's essentially just a lot of combat with different mechanics for specific enemies and then different mechanics for the bosses in there. And maybe every single one of these vault dungeons actually has a bunch of enemies that you go in there and defeat, and then maybe there's like 3 bosses spread throughout the entirety of that dungeon. And there's also the possibility that these things do end with an invincible boss, probably being the vault monster within that vault. I think that would actually be really cool. Every one of these vaults either ends with an invincible boss, or maybe whatever difficulty system we have in Borderlands 4, maybe when we get to the higher difficulties, it turns the final boss into an invincible version. So there's just quite a lot they can do with these, and I'm definitely a big fan of them turning vaults into more of a dungeon that has more substantial content in it, because honestly, the vaults of the Borderlands franchise have generally been kind of weak. Some of the bosses have been cool, but the vault concept as a whole has always just been a really weak part of the Borderlands franchise, and it's all been completely focused around these vaults, and they've just always been either a room with a boss in there that's not even an invincible boss, maybe a few chests, but having them be a much more substantial dungeon is, I think, what you would think of a vault being more than just like a room with a random monster in it. But I think this just sounds really good for the longevity of Borderlands 4. I think there is very much a possibility of these vault dungeons being more difficult endgame content, or much more difficult content for whatever part of the game you're in. And I would also not be surprised if we see specific endgame versions or just vault dungeons that are specifically made for once you get into the endgame. So I think these dungeons in Borderlands 4 could be a very cool part of Borderlands 4 as a whole and of the future endgame. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.